This is Desm 101. Thanks for tuning in. Thought I'd do a quick list of a few obscure NES games that I feel are worth checking out. There's a lot of other lists out there for top hidden gems and games to stay away from, but I thought that I'd shine a little light on some obscure games that I feel like don't really get much attention, that I feel like are pretty good and worth checking out, or even sitting down with a second time if you've already played through them a bit. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So the first game that we're going to check out here is called Fire and Ice. It's by Tecmo. It's basically a puzzle platformer that's the spiritual sequel to Solomon's Key, if you've played that before. It's actually quite similar, so it has some of the same mechanics where you're basically given a single screen where you need to figure out how to douse out the flames using the ice blocks. And you're given a bit of magic where you can make blocks disappear below you that are one diagonal down. It's a very challenging game. It seems very easy at first, but once you get going, it's very difficult actually to figure out how to get past some of these puzzles. I know that I've spent quite a bit of time on some of them. So I guess since it is a puzzle game that there's not a ton of replay value, but still it's a lot of fun if you're into puzzle type games from this era. Some similar ones are of course Solomon's Key, and then also Babel if you've played that on the Famicom before. It's a pretty similar puzzle. The next one is Flying Dragon, The Secret Scroll. This game is basically an early proto-fighter game where it has a few different elements put together, primarily a side-scrolling platformer, which isn't really a very good part of the game. A lot of people probably start up this game and give it a shot and feel like this is what the game is about, and that's just not the case. It's kind of weird at first to get through these parts. You have to beat mini bosses and acquire specific items to get to the next part. But once you get through all that and get used to what the game really is about, which is the fighting system you see here, it's a lot more interesting how they executed this for back in this time. There wasn't a lot of fighting games out there. Karate Champ was another one that was out around this time. It's actually based on an arcade game called Shanghai Kid that's very similar with the targets that appear on the opponent, and that's basically how the fighting system works. You just input a quick command and you can block that way too, basically, so the computer just randomly decides where the hits will appear next and you have to quickly react. It has a tournament, basically multiple tournaments where you go through, and one of the most interesting parts of it to me is that these characters have secret identities at the higher ranks, so you're actually supposed to finish, for example, this guy off with a flying super kick move, and if you do that, he'll actually transform into a Tusk Warrior, which is the goal of the game is to acquire the secret scrolls, which are held by the Tusk Warriors, and it's really difficult to fight them after you've actually beaten their normal, regular form. It's just a really interesting and exciting game. I really recommend it for anybody that wants to try out some early fighting games. So here is Solstice. This was always an impressive game to me graphically for the NES. It has that isometric viewpoint, or so-called isometric three-quarters perspective, where a lot of early Rare games and early computer games were done in this kind of style, and this is basically that same kind of concept done on the NES. It's really a challenging game. Again, it has a lot of puzzle elements. You have to get used to the odd perspective for some of the platforming, which is really tough in some parts, but I think it's pretty awesome. There's something really satisfying when you accomplish a difficult, complex jump in this kind of 3D space. And of course the puzzles are great like this. You just basically need to figure out how to get those boots in the corner by using this bad guy as a platform. And it gets way more challenging, and the place is actually a big maze. So if you get started with this one, you can really spend a lot of time exploring and checking out the entire game. It's very interesting. So Smash TV is probably a game that a lot of people know about, but the NES version isn't really talked about too much. It's primarily the Super Nintendo version, which of course is the best. But this one still puts out an impressive amount of sprites on the screen and has a lot of chaos. It of course is a little easier because it's simplified. There's things like mines are missing, but still the action is really intense. The controls are kind of tough to get used to, but if you have two of those advantage joysticks, you can actually use two of those, which I've done a few times, and it plays great, just like the arcade game, or two D-pads if you want to do it that way. I'm recording this off the AVS, and it actually has the 4 controller ports, so you can do 2 players with 4 joysticks or 4 D-pads if you want. Definitely an awesome 2-player game. Okay, the next one is Galaxy 5000. This is a very interesting racing game from the NES. It plays basically like your RC Pro-Am game, but it has different mechanics where you can jump. You still have weapons similar to RC Pro-Am, and the track layouts are kind of the same idea. But there's a lot of interesting things that happen here. So the basic structure is you go through circuits where you repeat the same level but with different modifications to the track, where they'll add hazards and obstacles to make it more difficult. And you'll race each circuit 4 times and then go to the next planet where the track will change basically. And so the first race of a circuit will always be the easiest version of that track, and then the 4th one will always be the most difficult. This game is just really fun. I've always found myself spending a lot of time whenever I get my hands on it. It gets really challenging really fast. A cool way to think about it is it's kind of like the Wipeout from the NES days. So it's got a neat like hover car kind of thing going on there, futuristic racing. Very rudimentary, of course. Okay, here is Werewolf, the Last Warrior, a Data East game. I always love the art style in this. It feels like it's got a very gritty anime kind of Go Nagai Devilman style artwork. It's really challenging too. I've never actually been able to beat it. You see people play this game kind of for the first level and basically say, what the heck is this? And they usually give up on it. But there's a lot of neat gameplay elements that you can figure out if you get the hang of it. So, for example, the caveman guy you start off as, he's able to charge up a shot, and it's like a projectile. It's really helpful to get through the early parts of the game. And then as the werewolf, you can pick up these anger power-ups. They're little balls, and you can see here you turn into the super werewolf. You're kind of like golden form, and you're super powered up as far as damage, and you can jump really high. It just feels really strong, I guess, whenever you're the the Super Werewolf. It's a really satisfying gameplay element. So you can see there I picked up one of the anger power-ups. So you basically get 4 of those. And the levels have this really interesting kind of layout where you can pick multiple paths, like go through an up or a downward path, like an underground or an above ground. And the platforming gets insane later on. It's basically just crazy timing and things flying around the screen. And anyone that's beat this game definitely has my respect. It's a really cool game to watch, basically. Lots of fun. Okay, this one's kind of weird. A sports game, Cyber Stadium Series Base Wars. I generally don't really like sports games, or I don't watch sports at all. But this is an awesome sports game, particularly for 2 players. So you can play the 1-player mode, but the AI is just really cheap, like most 8-bit games from this time, where they can seem to hit really great line drives, and they can crowd the plates and get scores really easily. Meanwhile, you're just lucky if you can even get one guy on home. But still, there's lots of cool things. You can fight each other on the plates. Whenever you're trying to steal a base or something, you can actually avoid getting tagged out by attacking the baseman. Alright, and here we have the Rocketeer, which is a licensed game, so I think most people would expect this to be a pretty disappointing game. But once you play it, it's pretty competent. I feel like the music is good. There's a real neat variety of weapons that you can basically have right from the start. All you have to do is get ammo, and he has grenades and rockets and regular bullets. Basically, it just uses more of ammo per each item depending on the strength of it, which I think that's a pretty neat system. You don't really see that anywhere in other games. The other cool thing is that, of course, he has a jetpack, which you have to pick up gasoline to use. But it adds a really neat element where, of course, instead of just the standard platforming and fighting, you get this added flying mechanic where it really, adds a bit more to the game. So yeah, this was a surprise to me when I played it growing up. I always thought, wow, this music kind of like stuck in my head and really got me thinking. It's a pretty interesting game. I've never beat it before, but I just think there's a lot going on here that you might not expect for, us. Okay, now it's Isolated Warrior, a shooting game. I'm a really big shooter fan, 2D shooter. This one's, again, kind of an isometric overhead perspective. And it looks like the same art style that's on G.I. Joe and Kickmaster. So I guess those are Attack-San games. But just the look of the characters and the bad guys and the environments has just always been really appealing to me, and the gameplay matches it pretty well. So it's a pretty fast shooter. You've got this 2 different weapon types, wide shot or the L shot, I guess like a long shot or a laser, and basically you keep powering those up, and you can get all kinds of other upgrades, like you can get shields and pick up life power-ups. It's just basically a really interesting and unique game. It's kind of hard to get the hang of the perspective at first and lining up your shots, but once you practice it for a bit and really try it out, I think that this game is worth your time, especially if you're a shooter fan. And you can see that you go through a variety of levels that I think are really cool, classic video game style levels where it's real dark and kind of biomechanical, like HR Giger inspired artwork. And there's even a level where you race like on a motorcycle, and the background really has this treacherous drop-offs everywhere, and you have to avoid falling, and it's moving really fast, so it's kind of almost like Battletoads or something like that with the reaction time. And alright. And finally, I wanted to talk about Cobra Command. This is a really interesting game, a shooter from Data East, another Data East game. I've seen a lot of people really trash on this game, but I think it's pretty great. Once you get used to the flying mechanics and kind of figure out what you're supposed to do, it's all about saving hostages. So if you like Choplifter, I grew up playing that game on the old Apple computer back in the day, and this is really similar. It's almost like a sequel of sorts. Now I know that there was a Cobra Command game in the arcades. There was also a Laserdisc game. It was like an animation game. It had a couple different names. I can't remember all the titles right now, but basically same idea. I'm pretty sure it's all the same source where they're getting it from, but this one was my favorite version. It's basically really neat mechanics from your ship, where it kind of flies, similar to a realistic helicopter, at least as a kid, how I thought it would. And you can also power it up by landing on those bases there, which I think a lot of people miss out on. Is if you land on, when I first played it a long time ago, I didn't realize that, but then you start figuring out, I can land on these bases, and you get these awesome power-ups like homing missiles, and you can get a ladder for the hostages to climb up faster, and better engines for your ship. It's just really a lot more deep and complex game than what you'd expect from playing it at first. Alright guys, thanks so much for subscribing and checking out the video. I appreciate any feedback and the views and everything. And yeah, keep on gaming.